I ask that all viewers please watch the entirety of this video before forming any conclusions. To begin this discussion, we must differentiate between science and scientism. Science is the systematic study of nature. Scientism is a belief system about science. A key difference between science and scientism is that science maintains an attitude of openness and curiosity toward the unknown, while scientism makes assumptions and premature conclusions about the unknown. Let's examine these assumptions. I have listed here 3 major arguments advanced by scientism, which are: modern Western science is always the only tool appropriate to understand all natural phenomena. The universe is constrained to the scope of scientific measurement. All questions that cannot be answered by science do not matter, or they cannot possibly have discoverable answers. I evaluate each of these statements throughout this video. To begin, if you closely examine each of these statements, you will find they are all unproven. Thus, certainty that any of them is true rests on belief rather than evidence. Scientism is a belief system because it makes belief statements about the nature of knowledge. I made this diagram to provide a contemplation of the nature of knowledge. To examine scientism's assumptions, we must visualize the scopes of information knowable to scientific instruments, knowable to humankind, and present in the universe. In order for one scope to be larger than another scope, there must be only one thing in the entire universe present in one scope and absent in another. Perhaps 90% of knowable information is scientifically accessible, and we can know over half of all that has occurred or is possible in the universe. Or perhaps we can know just 1%. To provide a percentage, I would have to be omniscient. All I can provide is the thought that a famous accompaniment of growth in knowledge is realization of just how little is known. It is oft forgotten that each new discovery of science unveils new mysteries. The assertion of scientism is that man should rely on science as his definitive and/or exclusive source of what he knows to be true and real in the universe. In order for one to adhere to scientism without contradiction, everything one considers to be true or real would have to have been demonstrated to them scientifically or be capable of being demonstrated scientifically. An obstacle here is that scientism itself cannot be scientifically demonstrated. For this to be possible, science, not belief, would have to answer the question: is there information in the universe knowable to humans, inaccessible to scientific instruments? Pondering this, one can see that science cannot answer that question. To examine that question without making assumptions, one would have to analyze the nature of science, which is an analysis that science cannot perform on itself. Without first contemplating the scope and function of science, a conclusion cannot be reached about its relationship to all knowable information. Here, the differences between science and scientism become increasingly clear. Science seeks to understand nature without bias, while scientism is a belief system fundamentally driven by bias. Consequently, for those who are interested in being as scientific as possible, it will be essential to abstain from unfounded beliefs like scientism. Those who value logic and rationality should also be very interested in abstaining from belief in scientism because its ideology contains major contradictions. The fallacy of scientism is that it stands against belief while being a belief system. We will return to our evaluation of scientism later in the video, but for now, let's break down the question in the title. Is there a God? My goal today is to provide you with a thoughtful analysis of ideas relating to this question. The most noticeable quality about this question is its logical classification, which is a yes or no question. Less common is the recognition of this question's ontological nature. For those who are not familiar, ontology deals with questions of existence and reality. Moving forward with our analysis, we understand an answer of yes or the affirmative is a case for theism or belief in a higher power. The opposite of theism is atheism, which asserts there is no higher power. The world is fixated on the differences between these stances, but I am interested in something different. Have you ever paused to ask yourself what these opposites have in common? They both require faith. Why is this so? I created this illustration to provide a visual. Let's start with theism on the right side of the image. It is commonly understood how theism requires belief because it involves embracing a conclusion that has not been empirically demonstrated. It is widely overlooked that atheism also requires belief because it too embraces a conclusion that has not been empirically demonstrated. This is because, as we know, science does not prove or disprove the existence of a higher power. It is not useful to argue that because science does not prove one case, therefore the other case is true. It is more useful to recognize that popular culture has an unfounded tendency to more closely associate one of these faiths with science than the other. In popular culture, one of the most common reasons cited for choosing atheism is having scientific inclinations or being a person of science. This reference to science as the basis for atheist belief overlooks the fact that atheism is equally as unproven by science as theism is. One might then wonder why it is considered appropriate to more closely associate atheism with science than theism. Logically speaking, it's not. As a result, anyone who is prepared to distance theism from science should be equally prepared to distance atheism from science because they both require faith or confidence in a conclusion that has not been proven. Why is this worth discussing? Commonly, those interested in living according to scientific values consider belief to be unscientific. Anyone with such an inclination should be aware that lacking belief is not equivalent to believing in the non-existence of a higher power. If you microscopically examine these positions, you will find a fundamental difference in composition. The critical difference between these two postures is the presence of certainty. Let's examine this. For the purposes of analogy, I have illustrated a belief here as a vector. If you've ever studied physics, you'll recall vectors are symbols used to represent force, and they have two components, magnitude and direction. If you look inside of a belief, its fundamental components are strikingly analogous. The magnitude, or the energy with which a belief is held, is called confidence, also known as certainty or sureness. Confidence is the attitude that comprises a belief. Confidence is the force that moves a person away from uncertainty toward making a decision. Your sureness of the truth of anything that you cannot prove has dimension. Because the answer choices are yes or no, the beliefs are necessarily opposite, so in a plane representing value, they are directed away from one another and can be illustrated by left and right, or negative and positive. The direction is the case that is believed in, affirmative or negative, but the attitude of confidence in either conclusion, that is a magnitude. All things considered, the only way to truly lack belief is to lack confidence in a conclusion. That position is represented at the midpoint of this graph and would be embodied by an attitude of undecidedness and or openness. If you possess confidence in either direction, you have a belief. For those who may be wondering, what about agnosticism? How could I not? In casual language, the word agnostic is used as a blanket term to encompass all attitudes that fall within the range of don't know, don't care. To be thorough, I have included a logical analysis of both positions. The main argument of unknowing agnosticism is the existence or non-existence of a higher power is unknowable to humankind. The main argument of uncaring agnosticism is the existence or non-existence of a higher power does not matter. In everyday conversations, agnosticism is thought of as a neutral middle ground removed from the concerns of theism and atheism. It is considered a way to lack belief. However, if you closely examine the arguments of both unknowing and uncaring agnosticism, you will find beliefs. With unknowing agnosticism, a belief statement is being made about the nature of knowledge. The believer possesses certainty about what can be known. Without empirical evidence confirming the scope of knowable information, this certainty requires belief. To entirely lack belief, one cannot be certain that the existence of a higher power is unknowable. To lack belief, one would have to be uncertain whether this is knowable. In the case of uncaring agnosticism, to entirely lack belief, one cannot be certain that the existence of a higher power does not matter. To lack belief, one would have to entertain the possibility that a higher power could exist, in which the question could possibly matter. All things considered, to truly lack belief, you must lack certainty about all things that have not been proven. The term agnostic only accurately references a lack of belief in cases when this total lack of certainty is present. When I first noticed the involvement of belief in atheism, I became curious where the tendency to associate atheism with science originated. An idea embraced by a group or culture to be true without examination is called a dogma. Many of us in modern culture are familiar with the phenomenon of dogma as it is commonly mentioned in critiques of religion. This critique esteems being a critical thinker, which is most popularly associated with questioning religious dogmas. Less often recognized is that being a critical thinker also involves questioning popular opinion, the status quo, and the subtle cultural programming of the society you grew up in. These are often external to religious institutions and come through sources like social media, movies and television, music, subcultures, friends and communities, and social movements. Because modern culture tends to fixate its defenses specifically against religious indoctrination, it is easy to remain oblivious to other potential sources of indoctrination which go completely undetected, leaving doors open for one's ideas to be subconsciously influenced by any unexamined dogmas from these sources. The danger of any dogma is that it can allow potentially misleading or ignorant patterns to go unnoticed or be prolonged due to herd mentality. How does this relate to today's discussion? The popular misconceptions about the relationship of atheism to science and belief can be misleading to those interested in being strictly scientific. Let's evaluate the issue of belief for both of these positions. Theism is popularly known to involve faith, so believers in theism are typically aware that they possess faith, which is intentionally aspired to as a virtue. Atheism critiques faith while being a faith at the same time. This is a contradiction to the values of that belief system. Accordingly, with this position, it is easy to intend to lack faith while unknowingly possessing it. By mentioning science, atheism attempts to assert itself as fact by citing an official body of information to give it authority. Upon examination, that body of information does not affirm atheism's assumptions. Therefore, any attempt to relate atheism with science is an appropriation and false association. When atheism attempts to reference science, what it is actually referencing is scientism, which we discussed earlier. Because scientism is a belief about science, it can be incredibly difficult to detect the difference between them unless one is being deeply inquisitive about the true nature of science, which we will discuss later in the video. For now, important to note is that scientism uses the existence of science, not the findings, as a justification to support existential beliefs and value assertions. Scientism attempts to explain away the great volume of mystery that is still present in the human experience even in the 21st century. This can cause people to become dismissive about ongoing mysteries rather than being curious and inquisitive as scientists are. One major ongoing mystery is the problem of consciousness. Modern Western science does not fully understand consciousness, a phenomenon which we experience every day. As we know, the scientific method emphasizes strict objectivity and material measurement in the study of the natural world. Consequently, when approaching the immaterial and subjective dimensions of consciousness, modern Western science encounters some obstacles. To ensure we are being scientific rather than dogmatic, we must closely examine our chosen methods of coping with these obstacles. Recall that modern Western science only offers commentary on what is measurable and demonstrable. At the line in the sand where a phenomenon ceases to be measurable, science ceases to offer further explanation. Beyond that line in the sand is where ongoing mystery still exists. At this meeting point between mystery and knowledge, we are faced with difficult questions, such as how to classify the dimensions of human life that happen to be unreachable by the material scientific method. In the face of this mystery, one thing is certain. The act of discarding this information because it cannot fit with a preconceived model of reality has to be among the most unscientific and nihilistic actions possible. Before even starting the experiment, scientism holds the premature conclusion that all natural phenomena will be able to fit into a materially measurable framework, or that if any phenomena cannot fit, they are automatically unimportant, uninformative, unknowable, or altogether non-existent. Before consciousness has been fully understood, scientism has already made conclusions about its fundamental nature. We must distinguish that jumping to unsupported conclusions is not a scientific behavior. Science maintains a never-ending awareness of the potential for new discoveries, insights, and revelations, even ones that can render previous ideas inaccurate. This constant receptivity to change is commonly forgotten when science is mentioned in casual conversations. The history of science is laden with new discoveries displacing and outdating old ones. Therefore, the formation of rigid existential views inspired by incomplete models is neither prudent nor historically attuned. From material studies of consciousness, we know that certain biochemical events correspond to mental events. This does not confirm that the physical events that correlate to mental experiences are necessarily the root cause of those mental experiences. Theories about the nature of this correlation cannot be conclusive until the entire scope of consciousness has been comprehensively dissected. Because the contents of the immaterial scope of consciousness are a mystery to the material tools of modern Western science, the potential involvement of these contents with events in consciousness cannot be conclusively discarded. Instead of the certainty that the root cause is strictly chemical, there remains possibility that the root cause could be at least partially immaterial. Until consciousness is fully understood, this possibility cannot be eliminated. In keeping with the pattern of new discoveries displacing old models, more recent research in physics has yielded potentially revolutionary insight to the subatomic realm. You might recall learning about atoms and subatomic particles when you studied chemistry. The development of atomic theory is attributed to Greek philosopher Democritus, who is estimated to have lived from 460 to 370 BCE. It was not until over 2,000 years later in 1897 that the first discovery of a subatomic particle was made by J.J. Thomson. Modern Western science is estimated to have emerged around the 17th century, so for 200 to 300 years following its emergence, the most modern scientific theory of the time incorrectly believed that the atom was indivisible. With full reverence for the watershed innovation of Thomson's discovery, even it was accompanied by the formation of another incomplete and partially incorrect model, famously known as the plum pudding model, which was later disproven. Anyone who may have developed existential views based on the previous theory would have concluded that the root cause of all occurrences is definitely and wholly explainable in purely atomic terms. In more recent history, not only has much insight been gained into the subatomic realm, including the revelation that even subatomic particles are further divisible, but also modern theories have emerged within the last 100 years, investigating the ongoing mysteries about the relationship between matter and energy. One such theory is the unified field theory, which is actively investigating whether all matter and energy in the universe can be explained by one underlying field. Until such theories are solved, there cannot be certainty that root causes of occurrences are comprehensively explained in atomic terms. There remains possibility that root causes could reside in a field of energy more fundamental than the subatomic level. With full recognition of the abundant and impressive accomplishments of modern Western science, we must also recognize its dynamic and revisionist nature. To keep present progress in perspective, it is necessary to maintain awareness of past and future timescales. The meaning of the word modern constantly changes as time passes. What is cutting edge in 2025 may be considered obsolete in 2200. Since it is only hindsight that can truly reveal the maturity level of current insights, for now we are left with the ongoing mystery of just how comprehensive our current models truly are. It is not even currently a mystery whether modern Western science is unable to demonstrate certain phenomena. It is a known fact. Science cannot prove to you that you exist, that your mental pain is unbearable, that your frustrations and ambitions are real. If you think any of these things are real, you are already in the habit of using at least one modality external to modern Western science as a source of knowable information. I will include a brief aside for the segment of people who question those things. Entertaining that one does not exist predisposes one to mental illness, psychosis, and harmful behavior because one would have to be in denial of the many strong indications for their own existence, most significantly, their observation of patterns and laws of nature unchangeable by human will that can result in severe injury and or death if violated. When one is in severe pain, one does not sit and ponder whether the pain exists. One seeks pain relief with urgency, an action that inherently includes an acknowledgement of the pain's existence. Few people are prepared to entertain their question of their existence to the extent that they deny themselves food or attempt to defy gravity, which are not recommended. Even fewer people are prepared to wonder whether other people exist. A person who behaves as though they themselves do not exist may be self-neglectful, but a person who behaves as though others do not exist is called a narcissist. Considering these things, questions to these ends may be considered both dangerous and unreasonable. I included that aside to be as thorough as possible, but I am also aware that most people do not doubt their own existence, which is considered healthy by mental health professionals everywhere. This would be an example of one thing that is knowable to humans, but unknowable to scientific instruments. From here forward, the specific term I will use to refer to this modality of knowledge is conscious awareness. In order to argue that all things must first be scientifically verified to be knowable, one would have to reject the knowability of all things that are strictly known through conscious awareness, including their own intelligence, their own pain, and their own affinity for science. To consider these things real, but to also consider science as the only source of knowable information would be a contradiction. Additional concerns may be identified when one realizes that conscious awareness is a subjective phenomenon and it has a critical relationship to scientific information. Conscious awareness is the source through which scientific information is known. The dismissal of the subjective forgets that subjective channels can deliver objective information. You experience this any time that you observe a fact. The fact is only knowable to you by being processed through your consciousness. Have you considered that all facts you have ever observed were processed through your consciousness, which is a subjective medium? When that is pondered, the condition of the subjective medium is visibly of critical importance to science. The human mind is known to be subject to states and conditions that can influence the comprehension of observed phenomena. These states and conditions range from overt mental illness, such as psychosis, to more subtle and commonplace mental attitudes, such as denial and bias. Later in the video, I address the dangers of bias to both practitioners and spectators of science. For now, we must recognize it is in the very subtle domain of human thought where scientism makes its many errors. The attempt to deny ongoing mysteries does not come from science, but from a human desire for security and control. When forming a worldview, some might assume that in the absence of scientific evidence, the most obvious assumption is always the most reasonable. Closer examination illuminates a possible shortcoming of this assumption. Before reaching this conclusion, one must first ask, how much of the universe do our senses perceive, and how much of the world is actually the way that it seems? If you recall learning about the electromagnetic spectrum, this diagram shows us the known radiation frequencies, a very narrow sliver of which is visible to the human eye. We are also known to live in a universe with illusions. Illusions are convincing appearances that do not reflect the way things actually are. Commonplace examples include the moon changing size and the earth seeming flat. In the formation of our worldview, we must account for the existence of false appearances. That something seems obvious may not be a strong reason to conclude it is that way. In a universe with illusions and invisible frequencies, we know our five senses do not deliver a comprehensive picture of what is present in nature. Scientific instruments are very powerful because they expand the range of information accessible to humans by detecting stimuli that our senses cannot. The unanswerable question remains, how much of the information in existence is accessible to scientific instruments? Again, science does not answer the question, what information can science not possibly demonstrate? Aside from those factors, we must also consider that there are different types of information in existence. To start with the example of physical devices, the type of sensor used varies according to the type of information being identified. Carbon monoxide detectors are very effective at detecting carbon monoxide, not so much at detecting radio waves. As for the human senses, we know well that certain information is only intelligible to certain systems. You cannot hear with your eyes or taste with your femurs because those functional parts do not contain the mechanisms needed to decode and process that type of information. Science does answer the question in great detail how our physical organism functions mechanically and biochemically. However, because science has not fully understood consciousness, science does not answer the question, what is the fundamental nature and potential of human consciousness? Attempts to define what human beings are cannot be finalized without a full understanding of consciousness. In an era when this is still unknown, questions reasonable to entertain include, what are the faculties of humankind, and what types of information are intelligible to each faculty? How do modern influences, such as fast-paced living and technology addictions, affect utilization of human faculties? In what environmental and mental conditions are humans most aware of their faculties? Some might immediately see the relevance of these questions, while others might be unsure. Aside from the simple idea that understanding what something is allows us to more effectively use it, there is also the question of scientific relevance. What does science study? Science studies nature. It is easy to forget that human beings, including their witnessing of conscious awareness, are natural phenomena. If science studies nature, but the Western scientific method is constrained to material measurement, how will we cope with the natural phenomena that also happen to be immeasurable? The way this question is answered is the difference between science and materialism. We could be curious or we could be dismissive. Materialism is the belief that only measurable things can possibly be substantive and all other things are less important or non-existent. Because science is the unbiased exploration and discovery of nature, science does not offer commentary on whether immeasurable things can be substantive or known. The existence of science, therefore, cannot be cited as a reason to disqualify that possibility. If science studies nature, and nature includes one or more immeasurable things, the study of science is not complete until those immeasurable things have also been curiously and comprehensively investigated. The only alternative to this recognition is to discard, diminish, or disregard immeasurable phenomena so that the study of science can be considered already complete. Errors with this disregard are already known. Health science relies on reports of the immeasurable natural phenomenon of pain in its study and treatment of disease. In some cases, the pain is linked to a physical abnormality identified in the body. In other cases, after thorough physical examination, no physical issues are identified. In these cases, the patient's pain is not dismissed as non-existent, but is attributed to an unknown cause. This acknowledgement when something is not currently understood fully is readily practiced by health professionals. Another illuminating detail from this example is the function of pain as a subjective informer of objective conditions. Pain is a subjective experience capable of delivering objective information that a disease or injury has occurred. Thus, a worldview that is in denial of the existence and informativeness of pain could be specifically life-threatening. When this is realized, the danger of materialist dismissiveness becomes more visible. The subjective experience of witnessing pain in consciousness illustrates that because something cannot be objectively measured does not necessarily mean it is not present in nature or that it lacks indicators of importance such as impact. To argue that immeasurable things are irrelevant to science, but to also consider pain to be relevant to health science would be a contradiction. In one's own life, the avoidance of the unknown most commonly expresses itself in the dissociation from one's own mental encounters and questions about life's mysteries. For the scientifically inclined, this begs the question: when we don't fully understand problems, will we dismiss them, or will we become investigators? The involvement of consciousness with science raises alarms. Not only is consciousness a natural phenomenon, it is also the modality and foundation of all human activity, including both the practice and perception of science. Introspection and self-awareness are tools external to science that allow humans to minimize their interference with information that might be discovered. Self-awareness is the awareness of one's inner attitudes, motives, and biases. The dangers of bias to science are famously known. Starting an experiment with bias could lead one to overlook present information that may carry valuable insights, or to reach premature conclusions from incomplete information. Bias is not only dangerous to practitioners of science, it is also dangerous to spectators. Spectators who reference science in the formation of existential beliefs are vulnerable to logical errors that seem incredibly convincing due to scientism's mimicry of science. The most notorious of these errors is that science offers commentary on questions it actually does not answer. This can lead spectators to reach unsupported conclusions in their worldview that affect their view of their life, their relationship to the world, and their concept of themselves. For spectators, it is not a scientific experiment this bias interferes with, it is the living of their own life. Thus, it becomes essential to examine one's consciousness for ideas that misrepresent the demonstrated scope and function of science. This is the only way to ensure that one is approaching life with a truly science-inspired perspective. This topic highlights the importance of introspection. Without self-awareness, it is easy to mistake preconceptions as facts. A person living an examined life is the one who has dedicated themselves to identifying their unsupported conclusions and relinquishing them. This brings us to our next question. Does truth exist? Science says yes. Science is a famous originator of the idea that there is such a thing as facts, which are unaffected by interpretations and opinions. We cannot be certain of the logical soundness of our beliefs until we have first asked, what is the scope of truth? In the same sense that there are types of information, are there types of truths? We are widely familiar with the measurable, demonstrable type. The question remains, are there also immeasurable truths? If you consider your observations and experiences to be real, your answer is yes. A defining characteristic of truths is that they are not invented, they are discovered. The question then arises, how do humans discover information? To start, we must differentiate between information and knowledge. Information is embedded in the natural universe. Information becomes knowledge when it is processed by an observer. There is possibly an infinite quantity of information in the universe, if not a finite quantity that is stupendous. Human knowledge is a subset of this information. Information that is present in the environment enters human awareness through discovery. Learning may be considered the process of expanding one's awareness. Expanded awareness is achieved not only by increasing knowledge, but also by increasing both self-awareness and sensory awareness of one's surroundings. The impact that one's internal attitude can have on this process is profound. One who expects to discover nothing is less likely to notice information than one who is curious, attentive, and receptive. This is how a closed mind can distort our perception of reality. When approaching the undiscovered universe, the scientific learner is both curious and undecided because the amount of information that remains to be discovered remains a mystery. To achieve this approach requires self-awareness of the interface between the mind and the environment, the belief system, where ideas occupy space. Conclusions, preconceptions, and certainties are like clutter that keep out contrast. This gives rise to the phenomenon known as confirmation bias. Popular culture holds the idea that confirmation bias determines reality. Before embracing this conclusion, one must first ask, what is the relationship of confirmation bias to nature? Is the scope of confirmation bias's influence limited or unlimited? It is easy to make the mistake of regarding objective conditions as dependent on human acknowledgement. Whether something exists to an individual does not necessarily determine whether it exists at all, only whether it has entered into their awareness. On this point, we must differentiate between perceived reality and absolute reality. Absolute reality is the place where hot air rises and fire burns things. If you acknowledge these things to be true, independent of subjective interpretation, you acknowledge an absolute reality. All natural things are present in absolute reality, so questions about what exists in nature are questions with objective answers. Human choice and preference are not the ultimate determiners in the universe. We know this by the existence of laws of nature that are unchangeable by human beings and that existed before them. When this centralized and external character of environmental conditions is pondered, the relationship of our bias to reality becomes more clear. Confirmation bias only alters perceived reality. It has no effect on absolute reality. To be mentally convinced of the presence or absence of information does not change whether that information is embedded in the universe. That only changes whether the individual is acknowledging the conditions that are in effect. On questions of whether something is present in nature, bias does not determine reality, it can only align or conflict with it. For thinkers, scientists, and all interested in the pursuit of truth, the question would not be, what is my personal preference? The question would be, what is the condition present in nature? While we wonder, we can be sure the study of nature is not complete until all unexplored natural frontiers have been probed in examination. For material instruments to dictate what is knowable, human tools would have to be capable of setting constraints for what could exist in nature. Considering that natural laws predate humankind, it is humans who must conform their study of nature to the constraints presented by natural phenomena. In a universe where there are different types of information, one modality cannot be exclusively used to process all information types. This dependence would inevitably result in the omission of present data. Instead, the modality chosen must be adapted to the nature of what is being studied. Measurable information has a known importance and function. Could immeasurable information have a different importance and function? An examined answer can only follow an exhaustive investigation. It remains possible that the science of the future could have a more comprehensive view of immeasurable phenomena. For now, if you want to study the most fundamental natural phenomenon accessible to you in the universe, you have to study your own consciousness. You must become a metaphorical scientist of your own life, curiously and microscopically examining your preconceptions, influences, habits, aversions, solaces, motives, and life occurrences with the intention to identify and eliminate fallacies. Until you have confirmed that this frontier has been purged of obstacles that could be veiling external truths from your awareness, you cannot be certain what is unknowable to humans. You can only be certain what is knowable while obstacles are present. If there are additional types of information only knowable to conscious awareness, they may never be discovered by you unless you blaze the trail. As we near our conclusion, today's entire discussion may be summarized in one sentence. The only scientific attitude toward whether a higher power exists is openness. The midpoint of uncertainty is the farthest that modern Western science and logic can get you on this question. To go further, a possible source of new information is places that haven't been searched before. With introspection, mindfulness, and curiosity available, the information that might enter your awareness when space is made remains up for discovery. In the face of this final mystery, one final thing is certain. The spirit of a scientist is not indifference. The spirit of a scientist is to seek the answer.